Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we're going to continue our reading of Henrietta's War by Joyce Dennis. May 29th, 1940. My dear Robert, it is nice to be one of those people who are told to keep in the open air as much as possible, because it gives me the best possible excuse to neglect all duties and sit on the roof, which is what I am doing now. But it's all wrong to be here alone, without the Linnet and Bill and their friends sprawled about half-naked on mattresses, and you with your hat tilted over your eyes, sleeping like one dead, and Charles arriving in a hurry with a glass of sherry in his hand and saying, "I never saw such lazy people." How happy we were, and how little we realized how nice it was to be lazy and happy, without fear and anxiety and horror knocking at the back of one's brain like a little gnome with a hammer. Where are those children whose only anxiety then was to get nicely browned on both sides like a fillet of fish? And where are you, Robert? I know you aren't where you were before, but where are you? It's not much fun, you know, being a middle-aged woman, safe and protected, on a roof, thinking of other people in danger. You will say that this is no way to cheer a brave soldier, and how right you will be. You always like to hear about this place, so I will tell you that outwardly anyway it is just as it always was. On each chimney pot sits a motionless seagull. Out at sea a few people are doing a little desultory sailing and sea fishing, and one poor brute is having trouble with his outboard motor. Most of the bathing huts are painted now and look very fine. Faith, of course, has out-hutted us all. A bathing hut, to my mind, is a small wooden sentry box crammed with damp towels, sand shoes, black spectacles, melting chocolate, and fishing tackle. And with so many wet bathing dresses on the floor, it is difficult to find anywhere to stand. But Faith has procured for herself a sort of mansion in off-white, with pale green china on hooks, and a kettle, and chintz curtains with lilies of the valley all over them, and 6 green deck chairs with canopies and salmon-pink cushions. She had what she called a hut warming on Saturday afternoon, to which she invited Lady B and me and the conductor. Lady B and I went feeling rather sheepish, because, as you know, Robert, having tea at a bathing hut is one of those things old residents don't do. But, of course, we didn't want to miss one of Faith's parties. Faith was looking lovely in a pair of white linen shorts, and the conductor became quite pale with love at the sight of her. We sat on the green deck chairs with the pink cushions behind our heads and ate asparagus wrapped up in thin slices of brown bread and butter. "How heavenly this is," sighed Faith. "Perfect," croaked the conductor, looking at Faith as Hiawatha looked at Minnehaha with eyes of longing. Lady B said nothing. There was a rather strained expression on her face, and I wondered whether she minded Mrs. Savernac looking at us through field glasses from the top of the cliff. "What I want," said Lady B after a long silence, "is a gun." "Why, darling?" said Faith. "To shoot German parachutists," said Lady B loudly and fiercely. The conductor opened one eye. "Did he who made the lamb make thee?" he said incredulously. "They'll be coming down disguised as angels next," said Faith. "Or fairies," said the conductor. "And we'll have to look inside the backs of their collars to see whether they're bogus or not," said Faith. "I shan't shoot to kill," said Lady B with relish. "I shall aim at their legs." Always your affectionate childhood's friend, Henrietta. June 5th, 1940. My dear Robert, I am afraid there has been a certain amount of what my old nanny used to call creating here lately, and some of it by people who ought to know better. There was a lot of gloomy talk going on in a corner at the Bee one day, until Mrs. Savernac, scarlet with rage, banged on the table with her fist until all the reels of cotton and thimbles jumped in the air. "Will you stop it?" yelled Mrs. Savernac. Everybody sat in stunned silence, and after a minute Lady B stopped whirling the handle of the sewing machine and looked up over the top of her spectacles. "Mrs. Savernac is quite right, you know," she said in her kind, fat voice. "Gloomy thoughts don't help the men who are fighting, and good thoughts do. I am a great believer in the power of thought," she continued, pulling out yards of tacking thread. I take a big breath and shut my eyes and send great waves of hope and courage and confidence across the channel. And what's more, she said triumphantly, they get there. It struck me what a good idea this was, and on my way home I began sending thought waves to you and Bill, which was a silly thing to do just then, because I walked straight into the Admiral on his bicycle and fell flat in the middle of the road. When I opened my eyes, the Admiral was bending over me. It was all my fault, I said apologetically, conscientious of his distress. But whatever the Admiral's emotions, distress was certainly not one of them, for his face was beaming. "Lie perfectly still," said he. "I've sent for a stretcher." "But I don't need a stretcher," I said, remembering with horror that he had been attending ambulance classes. I tried to get up, but he held me firmly on the ground. By this time a large crowd had collected, and the Admiral, with a grave face, began feeling my legs, which to his disappointment proved to be intact. Then 2 delighted young men arrived with a stretcher, a lot of splints, and a tourniquet or 2. "I don't need those," I said wildly. "I've grazed my hands, that's all." "Stop the bleeding, boys," said the Admiral, rubbing his hands with glee, and each young man seized an arm. Mr. Bolton, my friend from the Red Lion, came running out with something in a glass. "No stimulants," the Admiral said sternly, and Mr. Bolton, distressed by my condition, drank it himself. Tourniquets may be a comfort if you have severed an artery, but they are nothing short of torture if you haven't. What they missed was a nasty bump on the back of my head. When I showed it to Charles, he sent me to bed and told me to stay there 2 days and not read. So here I am. Always your affectionate childhood's friend, Henrietta. June 12th, 1940. My dear Robert, it is Friday and my day for writing to you, and so I take my pen in hand, hoping that if you do have time to think of the day of the week, you'll remember that I am writing even if you aren't getting the letters. Sometimes I think of you a month or 2 hence, when we have won this battle, sitting down with a sigh and having about 15 of my letters handed to you in a bunch. It is a disconcerting thought, my dear Robert, I assure you. 15 letters about the trivial doings of protected people in what is called a safe area. Will you read them, or will you put them aside with a sigh as something which has become unreal? I can hear you saying, why should death and destruction be more real than people leading orderly and protected lives? Perhaps by then we shall have shared some of your dangers, and the substance of my letters will not be altogether trivial. Well, we are ready. There is no need for you to worry about us. I am sure there is no greater coward in the west of England than your childhood's friend, but I hope that if the bombs do fall, I shall be able to remember that every bang here means one less in France. The Home Defense Corps has made all the old gentlemen here very happy. Before breakfast on the morning after the broadcast, they began crowding into the police station and with sheepish grins began giving their wrong ages. But we married women still feel that the part we have to play in this war is mundane, unromantic, and monotonous, and there has been some ugly muttering at the bee. I can tell you, Mrs. Savernac in particular has been hopping mad with fury and frustration, and was all for forming a women's defense corps of her own. Faith, who happened to be sitting next to her, and who was sick of making buttonholes anyway, was fired with enthusiasm and spent the rest of the morning designing a uniform. Lady B said she wouldn't join if it were trousers, so Faith evolved a circular green skirt to the knees with shirt to match and a yellow forage cap which she said would look like gorse from an airplane. Mrs. Savernac said she wouldn't have me as a volunteer because I would get too tired and be frightened of the bangs. I considered this a gross libel on my character and set up a plaintive mew, but Mrs. Savernac patted me kindly on the shoulder and said it was my duty to look after Charles and give him hot meals at regular intervals because he is one of the key men. Then she gave me Faith's buttonholes to finish. It was decided that the Corps should be called the Women of the West and have 2 W's entwined as a badge. But it all came to nothing because Mr. Savernac put his foot down, a thing he only does on the rarest occasions, and the next day they came and took away all Mrs. Savernac's sporting guns, as well as her rifle and revolver. She is more or less a broken woman now. But the result of all this excitement was that Faith became thoroughly restless and discontented, and on Monday she went up to London to look for work. I did my best to persuade her to stay and told her the bee needed her, but she would go. The conductor is heartbroken and is preparing to follow her, which is silly, because he has a weak chest and has been sent down here by his doctor. Besides, we need him to play the organ in church. I had a letter from Faith this morning. She says she has got a marvelous job as animal ARP warden. In the event of a raid, it is her duty to rush out into the street and collect all the wounded and frightened animals and take them to headquarters. Charles says that when you think how difficult it is to collect your own dog or cat in your own home when they aren't frightened or wounded, it seems that her task will be of little practical purpose. I need hardly tell you, dear Robert, that the call to fill in our identification cards found me without the slightest recollection of where mine was, or indeed of ever having received one. However, it came to light in my work basket when I was looking for a button to sew onto Charles's pajamas. I find that I grow more and more absent-minded, and I blame the war. We are so constantly urged to concentrate on keeping bright, brave, and confident that it doesn't give a woman a moment in which to realize that she hasn't put on her skirt that morning, or that she is walking down the high street in her bedroom slippers. But I have been digging for victory in lumbago again. Lady B says I am the only person she has ever seen gardening with a hot water bottle strapped to her back. Always your affectionate childhood's friend, Henrietta. June 19th, 1940. My dear Robert, I have been feeling lately that I ought to make myself some new summer night dresses. Not that there is anything actually wrong with the ones I have now. They're very nice night dresses, for wearing in bed, which was the purpose I had in mind when I bought them. But staying in bed all night is apparently not one of the things we are going to be allowed to do this summer, and for sitting in cellars, firefighting, and tackling parachutists, not to mention submarines and collapsible boats in the bay, I think something a little more substantial than triple ninon and lace is needed. As Lady B says, it will be quite embarrassing enough to have one's old friends, such as the Admiral and the young man out of the shoe shop, administering first aid and carrying one through the streets on a stretcher without having to borrow a coat to hide one's shame. When I confided these anxieties to Charles, he said, "Quite right, what you need is some nice thick woolen pajamas." When I asked him whether he really fancied his wife wearing nice thick woolen pajamas in the middle of the summer, he shuddered and said, "God forbid," which just shows how unhelpful even sensible people like Charles can be at times. Faith wrote from London that thick silk tailored ones of the nightshirt variety were considered Faith wrote from London that thick silk tailored ones of the nightshirt variety were considered suitable, so I bought some material. I was engaged upon this seemly task last Thursday evening, and Charles was reading an Anthony Trollope novel as an antidote to the 9 o'clock news, when the telephone rang. I answered it, expecting the usual message about aches and pains, and heard Bill's voice. Everything went black, as they say in books, but it really was Bill, and in a hurry because his train was just leaving. I rushed back and knocked over a small table with coffee cups on it. Charles looked up with a serene, Trollope-ish expression on his face and said, "My dear girl, what are you doing?" "Bill's back," I said in a high, shrill voice. "Good," said Charles. "He telephoned from the station. He's not wounded. He's coming home tomorrow." "Good," said Charles again, and returned to Barchester Towers. You'd hardly think he had been worrying ceaselessly about a son at Dunkirk, would you? But he had. Bill has been home 4 days now. The first 3 he spent sleeping, but on the 4th he went down the town and got his hair cut, and then came home and said he wanted to go up to the tennis club. The club was looking its best. Little tables with orange tablecloths were out on the terrace. The tennis courts were sadly empty, but all the bowling greens were in use, and so were the croquet lawns, for, believe me or not, Robert, we are having a croquet tournament. "This," said Bill with a happy sigh, "is perfect." We ate our tea in dreamy silence, listening to the click of croquet balls, and the shouts of them that triumphed on the bowling green came faintly from the other side of the hedge. Quite perfect," said Bill. "Never stop playing croquet, will you? This is what we want to come back to. Always your affectionate childhood's friend, Henrietta. And we'll hear more from Henrietta and all about the home front during World War II in England next time.